Russia just deployed what some are calling a space shield over Iranian territory. And if that sentence alone did not make you stop scrolling, then consider this. We may be looking at a fundamental redrawing of the military balance across the entire Middle East, and almost no one in Western media is talking about what this actually means in strategic terms. Because this is not just about missiles and satellites. This is about what happens when two sanctioned, isolated powers decide to combine their most advanced military technologies, and whether the rest of the world is prepared for the consequences of that partnership. Let's break this down carefully because the details here matter more than the headlines. To understand what is happening right now, we need to go back to the beginning of the Russia-Iran military relationship, which has accelerated at a pace that very few analysts predicted even 2 years ago. When Russia launched its full-scale military campaign in Ukraine in February 2022, the assumption in many Western capitals was that isolation would weaken Moscow, cut off from Western technology, cut off from financial systems, cut off from arms markets. Russia would be forced to fight a degraded war with degraded tools. That assumption has proven to be significantly incomplete. What happened instead is that Russia turned east and south. It turned toward partners who had their own reasons to circumvent Western pressure. And Iran became one of the most important of those partners. Iran supplied Russia with Shahed series drones, which Russia deployed extensively across Ukraine. In exchange, Russia began offering Iran access to military technologies that Tehran had been trying to acquire for decades. The relationship shifted from transactional to something that looks increasingly like a genuine defense partnership. And now we are hearing about the space shield. So what exactly is the space shield? This is where we need to be precise, because the term is being used in different ways by different sources. And conflating those definitions leads to very different strategic conclusions. The core of what is being reported centers on Russian-provided aerospace defense systems being positioned in or coordinated with Iranian territory. The most credible version suggests this involves elements of Russia's advanced long-range radar networks, possibly integrated with Iranian existing air defense infrastructure, and coordination between Russian satellite reconnaissance assets and Iranian ground-based systems. Some reports go further and suggest the deployment of actual Russian air defense missile systems, potentially variants of the S-400 or components thereof. On Iranian soil, if the latter is accurate, that is a categorically different situation. There is a significant difference between sharing intelligence and radar data and physically stationing Russian hardware inside Iran. Let's walk through both scenarios. Scenario 1 is the intelligence and radar integration model. In this case, Russia provides Iran with access to its satellite surveillance network, allowing Iranian commanders to see real-time or near-real-time data on aircraft movements, ship positions, and possibly missile trajectories across a broad geographic area covering the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the Eastern Mediterranean. This would be paired with shared radar data from Russian early warning systems, Iran's existing air defense network, which includes Russian-supplied S-300 systems purchased before the current era of sanctions, would then be networked into this broader picture. The result would be an Iranian military that can see significantly further and react significantly faster than it currently can. Why does this matter? Because one of the persistent vulnerabilities of Iranian air defense has been the gap between what Iran can detect and what Iran can intercept. Iranian radar coverage has historically had blind spots, areas where low-altitude aircraft or drones could penetrate without triggering an early response. If Russian satellite data fills those gaps, Iran's effective air defense perimeter expands dramatically without a single additional missile launcher being deployed. Scenario 2 is the hardware deployment model. In this scenario, Russian-operated or Russian-transferred air defense systems are physically placed on Iranian territory. potentially manned by Russian technical personnel or advisors. This is the scenario that carries the highest geopolitical volatility because it creates a very complicated question about what happens if those systems are used against third-party aircraft, specifically Israeli or American aircraft. If a Russian-supplied system shoots down an Israeli jet over Iranian airspace, is that a Russian act of war? Is it an Iranian act? What obligations does it trigger? These are not hypothetical questions. They are exactly the questions that military planners in Tel Aviv, Washington, and Riyadh are sitting with right now. Let's talk about why Iran specifically and why now. Iran's strategic situation in 2024 and into 2025 has been shaped by a series of events that expose genuine vulnerabilities in its defense architecture. The Israeli strikes on Iranian territory, responses to Iran's own missile and drone attacks, demonstrated that Iran's air defense systems were not capable of preventing Israeli aircraft from penetrating its airspace. When Israeli jets reached deep into Iran and struck targets with limited interception, it sent a clear signal. Iran's current capabilities have a ceiling, and Israeli forces know where that ceiling is. From Russia's perspective, this creates an opportunity. Iran is a motivated buyer. Iran is also a geographically positioned partner. Iranian territory extends across some of the most strategically significant real estate on Earth. From the Persian Gulf Straits that control global oil shipping, to the border regions adjacent to Central Asia where Russia maintains its own concerns about stability. If Russia can establish a persistent military technical presence in Iran, even informally, even through equipment rather than troops, it gains something valuable. It gains a southern anchor for its own strategic posture. It gains a listening post and radar node in a region where Russian eyes are currently limited. And it gains leverage because the more integrated Russian and Iranian systems become, the more dependent Iran becomes on Russian maintenance, software updates, and spare parts. This is a classic Russian military technical partnership model, and it has been used before in Syria, in Belarus, in several Central Asian states. The technology transfer creates dependency, and dependency creates influence. Now let's turn to how other regional actors are processing this development. Israel's calculus is the most immediately consequential. Israeli military strategy has long depended on what is called freedom of action, the ability to conduct preemptive or responsive strikes against targets in the region without having to fight through an impenetrable air defense environment. Iran's air defense upgrades have been a persistent concern for Israeli planners. But the existing ceiling on those capabilities has provided a kind of strategic comfort. If Russia effectively extends its own aerospace defense umbrella over Iran, that calculus changes in fundamental ways. The key question Israeli strategists are reportedly wrestling with is the following. Does the presence of Russian systems, whether hardware, software, or integrated command infrastructure, create an implicit deterrent against Israeli strikes? Would Israel be willing to strike targets in Iran, knowing that doing so might mean engaging, damaging, or killing Russian personnel or destroying Russian equipment? Historically, the answer has been complex. In Syria, Israel conducted hundreds of strikes in close proximity to Russian forces without triggering a direct Russian military response, partly because of a deconfliction channel both sides maintained. But Iran is a different context. The political relationship between Russia and Israel has deteriorated significantly since 2022, and the informal rules that applied in Syria may not translate to Iranian territory. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states are watching this from a capability angle, not an ideological one. A significantly more capable Iranian military, backed by Russian aerospace assets, changes the threat environment that Riyadh has to plan for. The Yemen conflict, the Persian Gulf tensions, and the broader Saudi-Iranian competition all take on a different character if Iran suddenly has substantially better situational awareness and air defense coverage. The urgency behind Saudi Arabia's own ongoing discussions with Washington about advanced defense systems is not coincidental. The United States' response is shaped by several competing considerations. Both the Biden and Trump administrations have treated the Russia-Iran military relationship as a serious proliferation concern. There have been formal diplomatic protests, sanctions designations targeting Iranian entities involved in drone supply, and intelligence sharing with allies to track the scope of the partnership. But the United States has significant assets in the region that create their own deterrent dynamics. Carrier strike groups in the Persian Gulf, military installations across the Gulf states, and extended deterrence commitments to Israel all factor into any Iranian calculation about when and how to use enhanced capabilities. The more complicated question is this: does the deployment of Russian aerospace systems in Iran represent a form of extended deterrence by Moscow? And if so, what does that mean for how Washington needs to think about escalation management in a future Iran confrontation? Russia has not formally committed to defending Iran the way the North Atlantic Treaty Organization Charter commits its members to collective defense. There is no mutual defense treaty between Moscow and Tehran. But the physical presence of Russian systems creates facts on the ground that carry their own deterrent logic, regardless of what any treaty says. The broader pattern worth examining is what this partnership reveals about the emerging geopolitical order. Since 2022, we have seen Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China develop cooperation patterns that do not fit neatly into Cold War-era categories. These are not formal alliances or ideological blocs in the classical sense. They are transactional partnerships built around a shared interest in circumventing Western-led international norms. What makes the Russia-Iran relationship particularly notable is that it is genuinely bilateral. Each party contributes something the other needs. Iran provides drones, production capacity, and strategic positioning. Russia provides aerospace capabilities, diplomatic cover, and the implicit weight of a nuclear powers association. This is not a patron-client relationship. It is closer to a co-development arrangement. The question of how durable this arrangement is matters for long-term regional stability. Russia and Iran have a complicated history. They have been rivals as often as partners. And the structural interests of a major Eurasian power and a Persian Gulf regional power do not always align. Now, one scenario worth considering: what happens if the pressure on Russia in Ukraine eventually produces some form of negotiated settlement? Does Russia's incentive to maintain deep military technical cooperation with Iran diminish? Does Moscow attempt to use its relationship with Tehran as a bargaining chip in broader negotiations with the West? This is a scenario Western strategists should be modeling. There is also the question of what space shield actually implies in terms of capability thresholds. The term suggests something comprehensive, something approaching impenetrability. It is worth being skeptical of that framing. No air defense system, not Russian systems, not American systems, not Israeli systems, is truly impenetrable. The history of modern air warfare is full of examples of sophisticated defense networks being defeated by sufficiently advanced offensive capabilities. The question is always about cost and risk tolerance, not about absolute denial. If Iran's upgraded aerospace defense, even with Russian assistance, raises the cost and risk of conducting strikes on Iranian territory, whether for Israel or the United States, that is a meaningful change. It does not make Iran invulnerable. It makes the decision to strike more complicated, more expensive in terms of assets required, and more uncertain in terms of outcomes. For military planners, that kind of uncertainty elevation is itself a strategic achievement, even if the shield is not total. The signals worth watching in coming months are specific. Changes in Israeli Air Force training patterns and exercise scenarios often reflect updated threat assessments in practical form. Diplomatic signals from Moscow about the scope of the Russia-Iran military relationship will matter. Iranian public statements about new defense capabilities sometimes serve as deterrence communication to regional adversaries. And changes in American military posture in the Gulf region, carrier deployments, command asset status, will signal how Washington is calibrating its own response. What we are witnessing at the analytical level is the gradual consolidation of a new regional security architecture in the Middle East. One that looks fundamentally different from the architecture that existed even 5 years ago. The assumptions that have governed American and Israeli strategy in the region for decades. About air superiority, about the costs of action versus inaction, about the strategic isolation of Iran, are being stress-tested in real time. Whether the space shield is real in its fullest form, partial or primarily a signaling exercise, the underlying dynamic it represents is not going away. Russia and Iran are building something together. Understanding what that something is before it becomes fully operational is one of the more important analytical tasks for anyone trying to assess where this region is headed. The picture is incomplete, the intelligence is contested, and the scenarios range from manageable to genuinely consequential. The honest assessment is this: we do not yet know exactly what has been deployed, how integrated the systems are, or how Moscow and Tehran intend to use this partnership going forward. But the direction of travel is clear. And in geopolitics, direction of travel is often more important than current position. What we are watching unfold in the Middle East is not a sudden rupture. It is the visible surface of a process that has been building for years. The Russia-Iran aerospace partnership is a symptom of a broader restructuring of global security relationships, driven by the pressures of sanctions, the lessons of Ukraine, and the calculations of two states that have found mutual utility in each other's capabilities. Whether this arrangement proves durable, and whether it fundamentally alters the regional balance, will depend on decisions that have not yet been made. In Moscow, in Tehran, in Tel Aviv, and in Washington. The analysis continues. The stakes are significant. If this kind of detailed, scenario-based analysis is what you come here for, then make sure you are subscribed. Because the developments we are tracking do not slow down between videos, and neither does our coverage. Hit the like button if this breakdown gave you a clearer picture of what is actually happening here. And turn on notifications so you do not miss the next analysis when the situation develops further. The next piece of this puzzle is already moving,